So with that, I think Canada is not immune in any way from the financial crisis, and I think when anybody takes a sobering look at the exposure that our big six Canadian banks have to the international derivatives market, one can find that this, the health and soundness of the Canadian banking system is a little more than a plagiarism and a fraud, and that over $26 trillion of derivative exposure is contained on the balance books of our big six banks. And the Boland regime, which has now been put into motion internationally by the Bank of International Settlements and the FSB, Financial Stability Board, that Boland regime, which was conducted and put into motion to confiscate bank deposits in the case of Cyprus over a year ago, when these big systemically important banks required life support, this is now being put into motion in Canada as well. Meaning you don't do something like that unless you intend to use it, and it's global. It's in the US Dodd-Frank bill, it's across the European zone, it's in Australia, and this is the next phase or trigger to the blowout of the system, which we saw mirrored on a smaller scale in the case of the Great Depression, when broker call loans were all called in that blew out the bubble that was then, sustaining what was called the Roaring '20s. So the time frame is limited to change the system by restoring Glass-Steagall and bankrupting Wall Street before they bankrupt nations. And this bill is very, very far in an advanced phase of a fight, which most Canadians and even many Americans aren't fully aware of. And before we go into the next presentation by a champion, currently a state representative from Maine, Andrea Boland, before we go into that, I'd like to read a message of greetings from Mayor Burnaby, British Columbia, Mayor Corrigan, who has for a long time been an advocate of a new system and who has worked to champion his city council to bring a endorsement for our call for a global Glass-Steagall, and I'd like to read that here. Good afternoon, Committee for the Republic of Canada Conference attendees. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity today to participate in this conference by saying a few words about Burnaby Council's support for the restoration globally of Franklin Roosevelt's 1933 Glass-Steagall Banking Act. In response to a correspondence from CRC's Dr. Robert Hux last year, requesting that Burnaby City Council join other municipal and state governments in signing a petition to appeal to global leaders to enact global Glass-Steagall legislation, and after review of the proposal by council committees and city staff, Burnaby's Finance and Civic Development Committee recommended that Burnaby Council support the Committee for the Republic of Canada in its efforts to introduce a global provision that separates commercial, bank, and investment banking activities as provisioned in the U.S. Bank Act of 1933, commonly referred to as Glass-Steagall. They also recommend that I, as Mayor of Burnaby, on behalf of Burnaby City Council, write a letter of support to Committee for the Republic of Canada in their appeal to the city and other municipal and state governments to encourage the enactment of global Glass-Steagall legislation. Burnaby City Council supported this recommendation, recognizing that a return to Glass-Steagall legislation for the U.S. and introduction to global community puts forth a foundational necessity that was identified after the Great Depression, one that will support a stronger and more manageable banking system that protects the interests of the depositors. Burnaby Council appreciates the efforts of the CRC to increase awareness of the significant benefits of that a global Glass-Steagall would enable. We are pleased to support these efforts and look forward to a successful outcome that we know will benefit the citizens of Burnaby and all Canadians. Sincerely, Mayor Corrigan, Mayor of Burnaby, British Columbia. Transition now to the state representative, Andrea Boland from Maine, who has, for the past year and a bit, taken up the torch to fight for the restoration of Glass-Steagall in its two manifestations in the Senate as a bill there under Elizabeth Warren, as well as in the House of Representatives under Marcy Kaptur and Walter Jones's endorsement. And she has been leading different state governments to adopt this bill, beginning with Maine, which is putting a lot of pressure on the federal government and on the international press and national press in the U.S. to actually talk about reality for once instead of Kim Kardashian and whatever else is a hot topic for the minute. So with that, I think, can we hear Mrs. Boland? Oh, you just got to plug that into my phone?
I just did.
You just did? Andrea, can you hear us?
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to your meeting. You'll have to let me know if you can hear me.
We can.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. All right, well, I was asked to share with you something about what's going on in the United States, which is rather a large order for me in a way. I'm a state legislator. I'm not at the congressional level, but you're probably already familiar with some of the work being done at the federal level for reinstating Glass-Steagall here, particularly led by Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, along with Senator John McCain of Arizona, and my own Senator Angus King, an independent from Maine, and also from Washington State, Maria Cantwell. And also in the House of Representatives, legislation by Representative Marcy Tasker of Ohio, and Representative John Kinney of Massachusetts, and Walter Jones of North Carolina. So I'm copying your understanding of pretty much the nature of that, which is to separate the traditional banks from the investment banks that have been doing some pretty speculative gambling with the depositors' money under the umbrella of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation of America, which is meant to just insure normal everyday depositors' money. And with the demise of Glass-Steagall has ended up being additionally an umbrella for speculative investing. So, of course, the original Glass-Steagall legislation was introduced in response to the financial crisis of 1929. And, of course, it separated depository banks from investment banks. And over the years, it has been weakened, particularly by regulators interpreting what the banks can do in rather relaxed terms to take in some of this investing that went on. And then in 1999, of course, it was repealed outright. So at the federal level, of course, there is that action going on. And unfortunately, the LaRouche PAC people in Washington are working very hard to support more and more sponsorship of these bills and passage of it, but at this time, they are held up in committee, but I'm sure will be reintroduced in the next legislative session next year. At the state level, 27 states have introduced resolutions asking Congress to go forward with Glass-Steagall legislation. Unfortunately, they haven't all passed, but the fact that they've even been introduced and supported to an extent is progress against what we refer to as the banksters here that work so hard to provide disinformation and misinformation to block work by well-meaning legislators. In 4 states, the resolutions did pass by large majorities, and those included Indiana, Alabama, South Dakota, and my own state of Maine. I became involved with Glass-Steagall at the state level when I attended the National Conference of State Legislatures in Atlanta last year, August 2013. And I had been in touch with the Diane Sayers, Rosenblatt, and all, but when I got there, it turned out that the state senator from Delaware, who was bringing a resolution to the NCSL, a committee on banking, kind of at the last minute withdrew it under duress. She had stood up strongly to the banking interests that were trying to keep her from bringing the resolution for some time. But finally the threat got so worrisome to her that she felt she had to withdraw. And so that didn't get heard by the Committee on Banking. But what the LaRouche PAC people figured out is that we could bring an amendment to a totally different resolution that was being proposed at what would be the full general session later in the week. So at that, I agreed to take up the amendment, and they gave me a very fast course, a lot of information in addition to what my knowledge already was. But they provided me with a lot of more information and introduced me to others who were supportive of it, who weren't state legislators. And we made our argument at the general session. And I think we took the bankers and the NCSL somewhat by surprise. They were surprised to see it popping up when they thought they had killed it off. So there was a little excitement around the room. But in any event, I spoke on it. There were a number of allies who also spoke in it from different states. And ultimately, the vote gave it, we heard 1/3 of the vote. At that,
Sorry.
we heard 1/3 of the vote at that very large meeting. What surprised me were the states that did not vote in favor, states that I knew had a personality such that you would very much expect that they would have been supportive of it. And it only suggested to me that the burden of overcoming the lobbying of the banks was huge. So in Washington, D.C. then, in the following December, this past December, I presented the Glass-Steagall resolution to the banking committee of the NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislatures, which is the largest organization of state legislatures in the country. There are thousands of members. But anyway, at the December meeting, it's usually smaller. The summer one was the big one. Anyhow, in December, I presented it to the banking committee there and had a very strong pushback because so many of the members of the banking committee are leaders of their own banking committees back in their separate states. And very often those folks are pretty closely tied to the banking industry itself. So, what I pointed out at the time is that there were current front page newspaper stories on these very large, $1 billion fees that had been assessed to a couple of the big banks as fines against their fraudulent practices. That was in the news. In the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, all that, they were showing it. So I pointed that out. I also pointed out my own story, personal story, because I have been a real estate title examiner for years, which means that I do title searches on real estate property to make sure that it's a safe investment for both the buyer and the bank who might be giving a mortgage on it. And what I had noticed over the years was a weakening of what the standards were that were expected, what my clients were expecting of me, from going originally from having to be very, very careful and very precise to assure that there was no clause there that would result in a problem situation in the loan, to a place where it was just hurry up, get it out the door, cut corners, don't go back as far as you used to. All these sorts of things. I didn't generally follow that, but obviously those in my business were under that kind of pressure. And we were also seeing that the kinds of mortgages that were being provided for properties that we knew about seemed quite excessive. And then it was explained with, what is this all about? Well, it's for the secondary mortgage market. You have to do this and this and this and that, but if I just hurry up and get it out the door. And so that's where the focus became then. More, faster, and lower standards that they were looking for because the banks were going to sell it. So I didn't know it at the time, but I was seeing the beginning of the problem of the banks getting into poor value mortgages just to quickly sell them off and sell them as other investments. So I pointed those things out to the people there, and I also said that I understood that those present who had the responsibility for trying to raise money for elections would probably have a hard time supporting this resolution. And I understand the conflict that they're under. Well, I certainly got attacked for those remarks. And, but it's absolutely true, and anybody who's in a legislature knows that raising money is an issue in politics, and it's kind of an ugly one sometimes. In any event, that resolution did not pass out of committee. But, I also want to point out to you that before I entered that room, there were bankers from the big banks, J.P. Morgan, Citibank, Bank of America, who accosted me in the lobby outside of the meeting room, asking me if I really, really wanted to do this, and did they know who I was, did I know who they were, and reminded me of the people that they have employed in Maine and even in my city. And why didn't I talk to them? And did I know this? And they were pretty threatening, really, even, threatening that it could be bad for my political career. Well, I never planned to have a big political career anyway, so it didn't matter. But then it was all sounded foolish to me. But they went to the trouble of going to one state legislator in one of 50 states, and a very rural one of that, to try very hard to get me to not bring that resolution. So that was the end of that then, last December in Washington. Just this month in Minneapolis, I brought it again to the banking committee. Not one person spoke in favor of Glass-Steagall, although the LaRouche Tax people and I had spoken to a number of people who were in support of it. It was as though they were intimidated into silence from speaking. I pointed out how petitions, about 162 organizations that have been urging senators to co-sponsor Glass-Steagall put out petitions, and they gave about 600,000 signatures, which they had brought to the Senate to ask for passage of Glass-Steagall. I also pointed out that the vice chair of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, that insures, traditional bank deposits, was in favor of Glass-Steagall, and pointing out that the three large, and read the quote from him saying that the average value of derivatives that they've been investigating, the three largest banking firms, exceeded $60 trillion each. A total of $180 trillion, which was a 30% increase over the level at the start of the banking crisis. So, knowing that all those petitioners of their constituents across the state and the FDIC vice chair, and knowing personally the problems evolving to states and localities because of the loss of money in the system and therefore high unemployment and unimportant loans, well, I shouldn't say unimportant loans, but the value of money going into serious development was not there. That the states were in trouble, but the federal level didn't have the money to share with the states. The states were pushed so that they didn't have as much to share with towns and cities, And the whole thing was backing up to the average citizen and homeowner to make up the difference, or suffer a lack of services and help. I also pointed out to them how the Federal Reserve had been buying bad securities from the big banks to the tune of $85 billion a month after month after month after month. It just very recently dropped down to $75 billion a month, buying bad securities that's now on the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve in the United States. So with all of that, I challenged them to say that they did not take seriously Thomas Hennig, the Vice Chair of the FDIC's call for separating the commercial banks from the investment banking and going with Glass-Steagall. People sat silent except for a handful of people who attacked for one reason or another the bill. And so in that committee, there were probably 40 or 50 people around this large table. And the Glass-Steagall resolution that I proposed has got over the votes of only 2 states. There has to be 1 vote for the state, so the majority of the people who were part of the committee, whatever they decided. And my state was not one of them, because there were 2 of us from Maine there, and the other one opposed me also. So it's also very close with the banking industry. So that's kind of the place where we are today. Just recently, the 11 biggest U.S. banks failed their financial test again. They were to submit a plan to unwind the bank in the event of another crash. None of them seem to be able to do it or present a plan. So where the situation is pretty dire, and I think what the challenge is for people to have courage to speak up and take this on. The ability to get by sort of a natural human instinct to deny, to go into this way out. And I think really the only way out is a Glass-Steagall solution. And the disinformation that currently and consistently pours out from the bank saying, oh, this would be a dreadful thing to do, it would be the end of our banking system, we couldn't compete on the world stage. Well, a lot of these banks are looking at bankruptcy anyway. We currently have over $300 trillion in derivatives that the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation that is supposed to be able to back these things up is supposedly going to be able to do with only $40 to $50 billion. So $40 to $50 billion looking to cover $300 trillion. Ain't gonna work. So I just wanted to share with you some of the bad information that I had for you, that at the federal level there are people who are working very hard at it. Senator Elizabeth Warren is most noteworthy in that regard. There are people at the state level who understand the problem and would like to support it. Some don't have the courage to in the face of banks making threatening remarks about what might happen in their state if they do, or what might happen to them if they do. And so the way I look at it is we really need grassroots action. The states need to give cover to the federal lawmakers so that they can feel they're supported. Somebody's got their back. So that's what the state legislatures have to do, that level. And the folks at those more local levels, the towns, the cities, need to give cover and support to their state legislators to say, yes, we understand. We've got your back. We're going to speak out on this. We're going to write to people. We're going to send letters to the editor. and start showing our government that this is something we really need. Now, I think I've taken more than my allotted amount of time, and I apologize for that. But I guess that's where I'll just sum up. Thank you very much.